All right. It's 10:16, 1 minute past start time, so we'll get going. Plan for today, I'll do just a brief overview, intro of what we're going to hope to get to today. Then from there, I'll discuss a couple key things that we need to get set up, and then I'll do a demo, and then there'll probably be at least an hour at the end of class to work in Maya and try things out when I'm here. So I can come around and answer any questions or answer them from here, whichever you prefer in these COVID times of not trying to invade people's space. So I'm also recording this using Zoom, and that's my first action item. So when this class, or when the demo ends, I won't record as I'm answering questions after the demo, but once the demo ends, then I'll upload that to YouTube, and somebody will need to go in. This is a new idea that I've got. I think it'll help make the videos better. Somebody will need to go in and send me timestamps for when things happen, so that if you wanted to use that video in the future, it's easier for everybody to find. So there are approximately 30 days or 30 meetings that we'll have for class. If we were to have a demo every day, that'll be 30. That's not going to be the case. Maybe there'll be 15 or 15 of you in here. Quite possible there'll be less. So I can't just assign one because somebody might not get one. So it has to be a volunteer-based thing. Who wants to go first? You only ever have to go once, but I need one person to volunteer. Yes, good stuff. So at the end of today, I'll add the link to the video links page. Just watch it and write down timestamps for when the big time blocks of stuff happens. Great. Cool. Thank you. So first up, Google Drive. We run everything through Google Drive. I mentioned that all of these computers have this app installed on it. This Google Drive app, which is connected to your NCSU account. So you have unlimited storage on here, which is wild. But a lot of people don't use it. They'll save it to the local machine, and then they'll be like, I can't get in the lab. I don't have my files. That is not how we work. We are beyond that. We live in the cloud these days. So everybody make sure that this app is open, so that when you open your Finder, over here you see Google Drive. Give me a thumbs up if that's an indication of you guys having it. Got one thumbs up.
Where is that at? Start?
Yes, so you should be able to activate it. You can just click on the little spotlight and type Drive. It should do that. It might ask you to turn it on with the web browser. That's great. Just be like, okay, until you see this thing over here in your Finder. Not working? So if you type Drive, you don't see that.
Can you show me, should we see where once you pull that up?
What is?
We should be looking at once you pull this up?
Okay, so once it's logged in, you should see a little icon up here. It's like a little white thing. If you click on it, it'll say your account and that you're using this. You should also be able to click on your Finder and see Google Drive over here as a selectable drive. You're good?
Yeah, I see the phone trying to download the rest of it.
Yeah, so it should be automatically set up. So the way that this works is it's actually online until you need it. So it doesn't actually download the files until you open them. So it should be very lightweight. It's just looking. It's just referencing your Google Drive and seeing what's in there. You can, if you want, I guess, you can right click stuff and say offline access available offline. That way it'll pull everything. And you can do that for individual files. So if this was like, if class resources was a folder I wanted to have access to all the time, even if the internet went down, I could right click and say offline access and it would automatically do that. That will create a lot of internet traffic. Shouldn't be a problem when you're at school because the internet's pretty goofy. But what I'm looking for is thumbs up that we are logged in, we're good. Okay, good. Good, yep. Okay, so most people are set up for that state. What I want now, everybody should have this My Drive folder. Dig into it. If this ADN 502 string folder isn't part of your drive, let me show you how you get there. So at any point, you can right click on a folder and say open with Google Drive, and it'll automatically bring up your web browser. And then this will be kind of the familiar interface if you're used to going into Google Drive. Shared with me is probably where you'll locate that ADN 502 or ADN 411. So to add folders to your drive so that you can see them in your Finder, if they're not already there, say add shortcut to drive. So you can just right click on a folder and then it'll be one of the available ones that will show up in your file browser. Yeah. So my drive isn't even there? Oh man, okay. So if you click here, what does it say? What's up? Okay, cool. So go, there's no way to. All right, I guess then in your browser, are you able to go to Google Drive and see what folders are there? What folders are in there?
I have the.
So here in my drive,
I added the ADN.
so it shows up over here. Interesting. Maybe it's still syncing. Is it, if you click on it, does it say it's up to date? Okay, so it might be pulling things and finding all the file folders. Yep.
So, what about, how much is the fine for
The shared one are like, I mean, I suppose you could try and comb through here. Probably the fastest way to be to go through your email and see if there should be an email from me where I invited you.
I'm sorry to have you do this. How do you link the folder to the desktop?
So, yeah, so if you found the correct one here in the like web browser thing,
Yeah,
you would just right click on it and say add shortcut to drive.
that's it.
That should be it.
Cool. And just my drive or computers.
My drive.
Thank you.
Cool. So this might be boring and lame. However, we're going through it step by step so that in the future, you can easily open up your Finder and just work in Maya through here, and you'll have redundancy on any computer that you're working on with all your stuff. So, how are people doing? Are we good? Can we move on to the next step? Or no? Okay. I'm going to assume that deadpan silence means okay. If you, in your Finder, click on Google Drive, and you can see my drive. Go ahead and open that up and find where your ADN 411-502 Spring 2022 folder is. Open it up. Open up project folder and open up hand project. And I see people are already doing what the next step is. When you have access to this, make a new folder yourself, put your name on it, and that'll be your project folder for the hand project. When I see, I think everybody's here today, when I see 15 folders in here, then we're going to move on. Three more. Two more. Thanks. I think that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4. 14. Who we missed? Jordan's in.
You're probably missing me,
Okay, cool.
but-
Let's- Is it still syncing or you? Okay. So. So now it's nice. Do yeah, in the project folders. Awesome. We are now ready to rock. So there often people will, if I guess at this point you can go ahead and click the Maya icon, get Maya booting up, and I'll talk over it as it's booting up if it's not already open. So often people, when they work in Maya, will just open up Maya and start going crazy. And that's fine if you're not really worried about keeping track of lots of different parts. But as I said, Maya is, or the things that go into 3D modeling and animation, there's a lot of parts. It's not just one thing. It's not a Photoshop file or an I guess After Effects has lots of parts, but Maya has scenes, it has texture files, it might have audio clips, it might have vertex data, like all these different parts need to be organized in a project directory. And thankfully, Maya has it set up so that it's pretty easy to initially get going. Um, Over here, you can just watch for now, and then when I go through it once, you guys will be able to do it. So what we need to do is create a project directory. So under File, you can come down to Project Window, and it'll open up this thing. And what you want to immediately do is hit New. So this is for this project. I'll call this project. That's the name that the top folder is going to be. And then I want to double check that by clicking the folder icon, it's going to go in the right place. Right now, it's not set to the right place. So I want to navigate to the Google Drive folder that I just made. And so there's my folder, Kirby Hand Project. So I'll make this the directory, select, and don't worry about these. We can clean it out afterwards, but these are the default folders that it generates automatically, and that's fine. I'll go ahead and hit accept. So when you do that, what Maya does for you is generates all these folders for automatically. What that's really nice for is that if you open up a scene, for example, it automatically goes to the scenes folder in your project directory. And also in the future, when you have things like textures, so your model needs to know where that texture file is. All your textures should be in a certain folder, which is called source images. When you set your project, you open up your model, it'll know what folder to go to for that texture, and then you'll be able to see your model correctly. If that wasn't set up correctly,
My Google Drive is connected to like the file thing, but I don't have shared with me. Like I don't know how to access the shared with me.
shared with me. Okay, so underneath of the, if you're in the web browser here,
Oh no, I thought you wanted us to do it from.
yeah, I do. So the first step for that, so if you're in my drive, I guess, down here, there should be a tab called shared with me.
Yeah.
Go ahead and locate the folder. It should be ADN 411-502. Right click on it and say add shortcut to drive.
Oh.
Yep. Yep.
I can't get my drive in the Finder. I think I like accidentally ejected it and it's
Okay.
like not coming back.
Sure, sure.
And I also missed how you got that like window where you make your project.
No
Sorry.
problem. Yeah, no, that's not a problem. So to get the drive back, click the little magnifying glass or command space bar, type drive. And then you should be able to hit enter. It might automatically log you in because I think it's connected to your login that you're currently on your machine.
Should it be showing up in the Finder?
Once it's once it's up and running, if you click the little icon, what does it say here?
What icon?
This little guy.
Oh. I don't, oh, it wasn't a sign in.
There you go.
Yes, thank you. And then how did you get the Windows name the project?
Okay, yes. All right, so one more time for the creating project directory, you click File, Project Window. That should bring up this. Click the New button. Cool, and then you'll be able to give it a name and a location. You should be good to go.
Thank you.
Yep. Great. Okay. So now, after all that boring work, finally start talking about Maya and how Maya works and what we're going to be doing in this project. So, project or scene hierarchy, or just hierarchy in general, is something that I'll probably mention a lot. And what I mean by that is kind of the reference point that an object has for where it's doing all of its moving and rotating and scaling. So if I were to have just a basic cube, And I wanted to move it around. You'll be able to see over here in this thing called the channel box. Right now it's set to 0, 0, 0. And if I were to increase that value, it'll move it in the X direction. If I increase the Y, it'll make it go up and down. And if I do the Z, it'll make it kind of go forward and backwards. That's kind of my mental model. Sometimes people flip X and Z. I think Z is forward and back and X is side to side. But it's up to you. Anyway. So the reason that these numbers are changing and the reason that this gizmo is right here is because this cube thinks that its reference for moving is right there. If I were to move that pivot point up here and rotate, that's where it's moving from.
Did you just click on a cube to bring it up?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, if you wanted to create a cube under the poly modeling tab, you can just click pop one in there. So this is similar to, if you're familiar with Blender, if you hit Shift A, mesh, cube, it's more of a button thing in here. You can also go to create poly primitives. There's like 1,000 ways to do it. There's so many menus, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
How do I get to just the one window display if I have the 4 views?
Yes. And over here, you've got the default.
Right, isn't it Facebook myself?
Yeah, absolutely. Over here, these are kind of the default views. This one is the big mono. This is the quad view. This is the dual view. And this button will activate and deactivate your outliner, which shows everything in your scene. Okay, cool. I'll go back to the mono. So what I was saying, as far as hierarchy is concerned, I have one cube. This cube thinks that its pivot point or its parent is right here. If I were to have a second cube, like this, and I do something called parenting, that would mean that I say cube 2 is now going to be the parent of cube 1. And what that looks like over here in the outliner is this. So previously, you saw that, or you can see that they're right next to each other. They're basically siblings. They're at the same level. So if I take cube 1 and I parent it to cube 2 by selecting this one first, holding shift, clicking this one second, and hitting P. Now, if I move this cube, they both move around because this one is a child of this one. Also, if I rotate this one, this is a child of this. The reason this is important is that this is a very basic hierarchy, but it's like very simplified in that when I rotate this bottom cube, it moves this entire piece. There's no way of just moving, for example, this one point, which is called a vertex. I can't control this vertex by itself by rotating this cube. So that's where our first deformer comes in, which is a joint. And a joint works just how these hierarchies do, where you have so those are two joints, joint 1 and joint 2. So just like that one cube was influencing the other cube, this joint gives you a very clear visual indicator of who's in charge. This one is the base, and this one is the child that's pointing to it. So when I rotate this one, that one follows. If I were to rotate this one, nothing happens. It's unique by itself. Why these joints are very interesting or very helpful for doing characters is because if I took a sphere, for example, and I did something called binding the mesh. So this is what we'll be doing in the first project. We have the hand mesh, and what we're going to do is put a skeleton inside of it, bind the hand mesh to the skeleton, and then do this next step of the process, which is painting influence or painting weights. So if I were to click this joint, select the mesh. So who here watched the videos on the Maya interface? What is this thing called?
Not the workspace, I don't know.
It's just, so if you're ever wondering, it's just a menu set selector. So Maya has so many menus, it can't do all the menus at once. How great. So if you have specific tasks, like right now with modeling, for example, you would want to have the modeling tray up so that these options are more related to modeling. What I need is actually rigging, because I need my options for rigging, which include skin. So now that I've used the menu set selector to set it to rigging, I can come over here to the skin and say bind skin. I'll just use the default options. If you ever want to change options in Maya, this little square thing is an indicator for bringing up your options. I'm not going to do that right now. We'll just go ahead and bind. Watch it happen. So if I move this base joint, it moves the entire sphere. If I just move this joint, it wiggles only part of the sphere. So why is this happening? So the secret is here. So if I select my object that is the mesh that has been bound, I'm able to see the influence that a skeleton has on that mesh by right-clicking and saying paint skin weights tool. And when you do that, it brings up the tool menu, and you can dock it over here. You can always get back to it. And so over here, you can see the two joints that are influencing my mesh, joint 1 and joint 2. And there's some kind of gradient visualization over here, which is the kind of the default indicator that Maya has for what's happening. So let's go ahead and use a color ramp to be a little clearer, because the gray, like, it's a little less clear. So if I select joint 1, you can see that this is orange, and then it kind of goes down to green over here. And what that means is red is 100% influence, or like it's completely saying where these vertices should go, which is what all meshes are. They're just made up of these little points. So that's what the paint weights are talking to, each individual vertex. And so used to a different keyboard. Tricky. So bring this back up. So you can see joint 1 is heavily influencing basically this entire half of the sphere, and it's a little bit less influencing over here. The reason being that this joint is influencing this part of the sphere and not so much over here. The thing to keep in mind is that the reason it's behaving this way with this operation is due to this one option, which is normalized weights. So anytime you see normalized in games or 3D applications, that means that it's taking a value that might be some enormous thing and making it 0 to 1. So anytime you see normalized, that means that the value is 0 to 1. Why that's important is for each of these verts, I'm saying that joint 1, for example, if I select this vert, joint 1 would have like 0.8% to joint 1 and 0.2% to joint 2, and that adds up to 1. It always has to add up to 1. So when you're doing paint weights, that's the thing to keep in mind. For example, if I have a finger and I have joints going down that finger, and I take some influence to here at the end, that means I'm taking influence away from something else, because it always adds up to 1. Where that can get you in trouble sometimes is using the tool of smoothing. So it's kind of cool that you can, let's do a little trickeration here. And so up here, you have a bunch of these very cryptic little icons. These ones are super useful. I use them all the time. And what they do is let you avoid or include certain things that you can select. So I like to turn off joints sometimes, because anytime you do a drag select, the joint will always be like, hey, I'm selected. And so you can't grab If I were to do that with joints, then it would automatically select the joint. So I like to turn joints off or turn mesh off sometimes if I don't want to select my mesh or whatever. Anyway, so with these verts active, I can come over here to my paint tool. And because I made a vert selection first, I can use the replace option in my paint and flood. And what it will flood is basically this value. So when I do that, you can see it puts 100% influence on whichever joint I have selected. So the one that I want to put 100% influence on is joint 2. Go ahead and flood that. So you can see now it's like real jaggedy because this joint is influencing these verts, but then there's not really a nice smooth transition between the two. So sometimes what people will do, instead of individually going in and like manually painting the vert to blend between, you can sometimes use, you can use the smooth paint. And so what that does is tries to create a little bit easier transition between the zones. And with this particular rig, I'm not worried about where that influence is going because there's only 2 joints. There's only 2 places it could go. But sometimes, for example, if you're in a hand, you're smoothing out this little knuckle, Maya will throw some influence on the wrist for the end of your finger because it doesn't know what to do. It's a computer. So when you're using the smooth operation, be careful. That's my one hint for this first project. Sometimes smoothing is good and you'll get exactly what you want, but sometimes it'll randomly throw influence to a different joint that you didn't intend it to, and you'll just need to go and remove it. Cool, so I'll pause there. There's a fire hose of information sometimes, so I try to take a pause. Any questions so far on what a joint is, how to attach a joint to a mesh, or what a paint weight is?
Oh, you can go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
How do you like navigate the view? If that makes sense, like if I want to like rotate my view to like be under the shape or like, you know, move around.
Okay,
How
sure.
do you do that with your mouse and stuff?
Yes, okay, so we will take a step back. Perhaps I hopped in. We'll hop. So navigating the viewport. It's a 3-button system in Maya. If you hold Alt, that's how you do all your navigation. So holding Alt and left clicking will orbit. Holding Alt and middle mouse clicking will pan in. And holding Alt and right clicking will zoom in and out. The other one that I use constantly, the hotkey F, which stands for focus. So if you click a thing and you hit F, it'll just put it right in the middle of the screen. And it also will make it so that when you orbit, you're orbiting right around that thing, which is really, really, really useful. Mhm.
Where did you go to get the joint again at the top?
Sure. So here under skeleton, you can say create joints. That's one way to get to it. If you're in your rigging tab, you can just click the little button for joints, and then your cursor will change to this crosshair versus the little thing that indicates that when you click, you're going to drop a joint in the scene.
I guess mine's at the top, and when you click the rigging, it didn't change the set menu, so like purple one's just still orange. So is that correct?
So here, when you're in rigging, you don't see the option for skeleton.
Okay, yes.
Okay.
Do you mind going back over how you open the weight?
Sure, sure. So if you've already gone through the operation of selecting your joints, holding shift, clicking your mesh, and then saying skin bind, you'll know that your mesh has been bound. Underneath of your channel box menu, you'll see this thing called skin cluster. That indicates that that's been added to the mesh so that you can access people. If that is there, you should be able to right click on your mesh and say paint weight. That'll bring it up.
So wait, skin cluster and
Oh.
just click on what?
Just if you are in your scene, nothing is selected.
Yeah.
Left click on whatever mesh you're wanting to edit or paint.
Yeah.
So that it's highlighted. then right click, and that'll bring up the little radio menu.
Yeah.
And then you slide over top of Paint Weights tool and let go.
And so, I'm assuming that phones in my have like as many stable clusters as they want.
Say this again?
You can have multiple stable clusters per phone, right? But you can have, like, if you wanted to like tie separate meshes to.
So you're saying like one joint can influence multiple? Yes, you could do that. I don't know why you want to set it up that way, but you could do that, yeah. In theory. Yeah,
Like really far back. Like, you look at my email, make them connected.
like normal parenting or the joint? Okay, cool. So yeah, if we wanted to jump back to where I started off. It might have been unclear why I was explaining parenting first, but the reason I'm explaining parenting is because it directly relates to how joints work. So if you were just doing a normal parent situation, so say you're making like a really simple little robot guy. And Mr. Robot has a foot and a shin and maybe a knee. And then maybe a thigh, right? So what you can do without joints is you could set up a very simple hierarchy, which technically would be what I would consider a grid. But what you would want to be aware of is what each shape, where each shape is going to be pivoting or doing whatever it's transformed from. So if I parent this foot to the shin, so if I select it first, hold shift, click that 1 second and hit P, then this is now a child of that. So if I move the shin, the little foot would come along. I can do that operation again with this sphere where I parent the shin to the knee. And again, to the top. So if I were to rotate the knee, everything below the knee, everything below the, stop selecting everything. Oh, I did it backwards. Sorry.
So it's like I'll do it, but then the parent and then we'll do it.
Yeah, so you can see like what should happen is, you pivot. Oh, I don't know why that's happening. Oh, I do know why that's happening. Pay no attention. Okay. All right, never mind. It's a bad example. I'll go back to my simple one. Cube and another cube. So this one is the child, this one is the parent. If I were to rotate that, the child would follow. If I rotate this, the parent does not follow. So the same applies for joints. If I draw out 2 joints like that, this one is the child and this one is the parent. Maya gives you the visual indicator, unlike the normal parenting, like when that cube was the parent of the other one, it didn't really tell you that. There's no visual indicator. The joints are a little bit nicer. This one is clearly pointing at this one. So I know if I rotate, that it's going to follow along. Does that make sense? Not, it may become clear as the example gets more concrete and related to something useful. This is all very theoretical at the moment.
I understand it, but I'll do it and then I'll go through it.
The what?
Like the two, like I have 2 circles,
Uh-huh.
and I like made one parent and one circle. And made this one together.
Okay, so if you look in your hierarchy over here, So you've got one sphere and another one. And you do the parenting like that. If you look over in your outliner, this is why the outliner is so useful. You should see this relationship. That means that one is a child of the other. If you don't see that, then that's probably why it's not working. Do you see that? To get this open, you just click this button.
What was the shortcut to parent? Shift P?
Shift P will unparent, P will parent.
How do you, sorry, apply transformation?
Pardon?
How do you apply transformation in Maya?
Freeze transformations. So select the thing, modify, freeze transformations. You can pick which one. Yep, so go ahead.
So also, it's like selecting all the words in this highlight.
Okay, if you're like this, so what that means is you entered into component mode. It doesn't really, that's the one really nice part about Blender. You know exactly when you're like editing the thing versus you're unhappy. Maya, you just sometimes will happen into that. So what probably happened is right click was held for just a second and you hovered over vertex. And what that did was bring up your verts. If you want to go back to object, hold right click and hover over object. And that should bring you back to there. Success?
I already not know, but I'm doing it, this is it's not.
Oh, it just P. Just P, not shift P. Cool. I'll kind of jump into the next section and work with people individually in probably 30 minutes. I think that'll probably be how much more demo there is. But yeah.
Oh, no, I don't have a question.
Okay, cool. All right, so like I said, this class is not going to be focused on modeling. You're not going to have to worry about necessarily getting, dug in and learn all the tricks there. Stuff will be provided. If you do want to model your own hand, I'm not going to stop you. I can help you out with that. But sometimes it's easier to go through the thing that you're not sure about first and then go backwards. So to import stuff into a scene, it's just like pretty much every program. Click File, Import, and then find whatever the thing is that you want to bring in. I went ahead and in the shared directory, I have a hand model. So you can go into shared materials, click hand and say import. So when you do that, your models should be dropped in and you should be good to go. The one thing to mention here that's really important, it has to do with the size of stuff. So sometimes if you go and you get a free rig or you go to Sketchfab or Turbo Squid or whatever, all of those things are authored by different people and they might be using different units. So units are an important thing to be aware of. By default, when you open up Maya, Maya is set to centimeters. So if I make a cube and you see over here, height, width, and depth is all 1, that's 1 centimeter. So this hand is that many centimeters long. This is actually modeled in meters. So that's why it looks gigantic. It's not really gigantic. It's actually a normal sized hand. It's just that the scene is set to be tiny little centimeters. If you ever wanted to change your scene units, that's sometimes a useful thing to do. I don't think I'll need to change it just because the hand is reasonably small. But if you did, down here, there's a little running person with a sprocket, or you can come up here to Windows and go to Settings and Preferences and Preferences. I'll bring up a way overloaded menu, but the one that you want is Settings. And you can see here, working units, linear and angular. So that's where you can either set centimeters, meters, millimeters, foot, inch, yard, whatever you're most comfortable in. If you were to look at your cubes and spheres and use measuring tools, that's what those numbers are related to. So at the moment it's centimeter. I'm just going to leave it. You can change it to meter if you want. Doesn't really matter. For this exercise, just be aware. Cool. So here I have a hand. And like I just showed with the sphere, what we're going to do is put a skeleton in that hand and attach that hand to the skeleton, and then start paint weights so that when I were to rotate one of the joints, the finger would wiggle and it would make sense. If I rotated that joint, I wouldn't want that finger to wiggle. That would be wrong. So the nice part about how the joint tool has come along is there's a couple options that will make your life easier. One specifically, which you can bring up by going skeleton, create joints, and then click the little box. You should see either this menu will pop up by itself like this. If it does, you can dock it by just clicking in this part and then dragging it over to somewhere, or you can leave it floating. It's up to you. I like to dock it so that it's easily accessible. Cool. So the option that I would highly recommend for this step is called projected centering. If I don't have that option checked and I were to have my hand selected, I come up to skeleton, create joints, and I start clicking. It might look like I'm doing a pretty good job putting the joints where they need to go, but if I rotate the camera, oh no, that's like terrible. Damn you 3D. So the way to get around this is go ahead and activate that option in your create joints tool, projected centering. What it does is it tries to find whatever mesh is there and put it as good as it can in the middle, which is usually the best place for where you want your joints. So I'll go like that. And if I look, it's pretty much right in the middle. Oftentimes for a hand that's set up this way where it's nice and flat, the view that I like to use for joints is actually the top view. Earlier I mentioned these are kind of your default options. So I can click this quad one. The difference in these three windows is this one is a perspective camera, so it has foreshortening. These are all orthographic cameras, which means they have no perspective. So it's really nice for positioning because everything is like right in line and you don't have to worry about accidentally over the horizon something moves. So I like to use the top-down view for laying out something that's set up like this. When I click here, that'll be like my base joint. And then where does your wrist hinge? Kind of like near the bottom of the thumb. If you think of here, maybe about right there is about right. And then the thing to notice as I lay these joints out, so I'll pause here, you can see which direction those joints are pointed is super duper important. And the way to see which direction the joint is actually oriented is if you select anything and you have your move tool active, which is this thing, or you hit W, that's the hotkey. The four hotkeys that are like ingrained in my brain, and that's the hardest part going to different 3D programs is not pressing those keys. Q is how you activate your select. So then you can just click on stuff. W is move. E is rotate, and R is scale. They're all right next to each other. So like those are the four that you probably will need to get familiar with the fastest. But if I select my joint and I hit W, I can see over here that the tool setting for my move tool is set to whirl. So no matter what direction this joint is facing, when I switch to the move tool, it's always X is this way, Z is this way, and Y is this way. You can change this to be related to the thing itself by clicking the drop down and saying object. Now the move tool is related to the joint. So when I move Z, it goes like that, and like that. So the way that I would recommend is really fast for checking the direction of your joint is you just activate the move tool, select it, and switch the axis orientation to the object. Then you can see this base joint is pointing right at the next joint. Then this joint. So here, see, I keep clicking the mesh. That's really annoying. I can just go like that, and then I'll no longer click it. Let's get it out of the way. All right, so now you can see the second joint is pointing right at the next one. And if I had made another joint, this joint would then point at that one. And that's kind of how the joint tool lays stuff out. It always points the last joint you made at the next joint that you created. So that can help you when you're laying your stuff out so that you don't have to fix things. The reason that is important to mention. And so, for example, so here I've got my 3 finger joints. This first one is pointing right at this next joint. That's great. So what that means is when I rotate in a single axis, right, like this, it goes right in line, like how your finger would, right? It's not kind of wobbling off to the side weirdly or rotating strangely like that. This end joint doesn't have that same orientation. So if all of these joints are selected at the same time, which happens a lot, and you were to rotate them all at the same time, the first 2 joints would rotate correctly like that, and then this last one would rotate in your direction because it's oriented differently. So when you're doing your joints hierarchy, make sure they're all pointed the same way, so that when you rotate them, they all rotate how you expect. If you have joints just pointing all willy-nilly, it's going to be really frustrating to animate with that right. I'm not saying you can't do it. And I haven't done it in the past when I was first learning things. However, it makes your life very sad. So I would not recommend it.
Really, how did you correct the joint orientation?
So it'll, so if you select it and you hit W to turn your move tool on, look at the tool settings for the move tool. And if you don't see that, you can just double click the thing and it should bring up the settings. By default, it's set to world. So you just want to flip that over to object.
Yeah, so did you correct the info that had a different?
What's that?
Did you correct the info that had a different orientation?
I haven't corrected it.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yes.
Maybe just see the joints.
Okay, if you can't see the joints inside the mesh, then the way to do that is, this is called a viewport, this kind of window thing. And the viewport has its own little menu. So the menu option that you want is under shading and X-ray joints. And that way you should be able to see through your mesh and see joints. There is a little icon here. So you don't necessarily have to go into the menu. It's this one. You can toggle it on and off. Cool. So what I'll do now is I'll go ahead and lay out the couple joint chains and then parent them afterwards to maybe make my life a little easier. So the first joint chain I'll make is for the wrist and the main hand. So I'll do kind of the base where I think the wrist will hinge. And then a base for all my fingers. The reason that I like to do that is so that this joint, the wrist, is automatically oriented correctly. If I immediately went into, wrist and then went down here to my thumb like that, that would mean that my wrist joint is now pointed at my thumb. I don't want that. I want it pointed nice and straightforward so that when I hinge like this or like this, it's all kind of pointing forward and not pointing at the thumb. So right now, this joint is oriented that way. And I don't want that. I want it pointing straight. Okay, cool. So I'll go base, wrist, hand. Then hit Q to jump out of the joint tool. And what that will do is end your joint chain where it currently is. Q. Yeah, or you can just come up here and click on the little pointer button. And then I'll start a new joint chain.
Is there a reason why my joint chain like is like, I guess it's green for the top two, but then the bottom one, it's still showing black, so does that mean they're not together in the same chain?
Do they look connected like that?
Okay, I guess I have to select it.
Yeah, if you have one selected, then when you select the base, it'll select everything underneath of it.
Okay.
And then, because they're children. Cool.
Might be that question, but
No.
why didn't you stop at the top of the video?
So what I'm gonna do now is make one finger joint chain and then parent that thing. So I like to make them separately, so it's easier to just let Maya point it the right way.
Okay.
For some reason, when I'm looking at human joints, they don't like lay flat. Like one's just like much lower than the other.
Okay, in your tool setting, is projected centering on?
Yes.
Okay, I will need to come and look at that in a bit. Yours is also doing weird stuff? Okay, cool. We could work through that. I'll get these fingers laid out and then kind of go around and answer questions before jumping forward. All right. So at this point, I'll go ahead and make one joint chain from the fingers. Yeah. So I've got one for the, I don't know what the technical name is, but I call it pointer one. So pointer one, pointer two, and pointer three, because each finger has kind of 3 hinge points. And what you can do, because each of these kind of 4 fingers are very, very similar. For this rig, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate that by hitting Control D. And then I can just shift it over. And if this hand is pretty proportional, like the middle finger is reasonably close in length to the pointer finger, so I'm going to hold off on moving the joints very much. For laying out, sometimes it's nice to have the topology of the hand visible so you know where things might need to go. If you want to see what your hand actually looks like, here in the viewport, there are a couple different shading options. One is wireframe, one is flat shaded, one is default texture. That's kind of, don't worry about that right now. And then wireframe and shaded. And so what that's nice for is you can actually see on the hand where the different topology lines are. And when you're laying out your joints, that gives you a good reference for, oh, okay, on this hand, this is where the first knuckle is, then maybe I should scoot this joint a little bit forward so it's in between those rings. This one's kind of in the wrong spot too. Pardon? Yes, so there's the clear one is cool. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's a little tricky to click on the right part of the joints. It's often easier to click on this kind of pointer part. So if you click on that, it'll do everything below it. And then if you only want that one, you can click that one. If you only want that one, you can click that one. Does that make sense? Cool.
Do you think it makes a difference if like it's like my joints are like slightly slanted?
Yeah, we can go over how to make it nice and straight, but this is just like first run through. So we're just dropping some joints in and seeing what happens. Cool. So now that I see, oh, go ahead.
When you do,
Controlled. Or you can, select whatever you want to duplicate. Okay, cool. Let me just move this into place. Okay, so if I wanted to duplicate this, you can also just go to edit. Duplicate. Oh, it looks like Command D will also do it. So this is Mac.
so how do I move that then out of it?
You can, all right, cool. So if you had selected your finger and you had hit Command D, so now it's duplicated, and it just kind of, you don't know what's going on in this state. I would hit W to activate the move tool, or come over here and click this button. That'll do the move tool. Then if nothing is still selected, you can just click over here, over top of the joint, and you should see your move tool pop up. Then you can just drag it out of the way. Good? Thanks. Okay. I'll kind of scoot these around a little bit, just so they're in a little bit better place. OCD. And one last finger. All right. So at this point, I've got, oh, go ahead.
What size have we found, so you can view the joints through the mesh? Because I keep switching mine over to wire.
So it's either this little toggle here, X-ray joints, or you can go to shading, X-ray joints.
Oh, okay.
Cool. All right. So at this point, I've got all these 4 fingers, but if I were to rotate my wrist, those joints aren't going to follow along because they're not connected yet. So just like I did with the cube and the sphere and stuff, you can parent all of the first joints. So this one, this one, this one, and this one. I'm going to parent all 4 of these to this thing. And how you do that is click the first one, hold shift, and then keep clicking whichever ones you want to be children. And when you're all done with your selection, you hold shift one more time, and then click the thing that you want to be the parent last. And then you do that. Your selection should look like this. All the children should be white, and the parent will be green. If that's how it looks, if you hit P, now your joint chain should look like this, where there's a little connector for all 4 of those joints to this group thing. Success? Sure, yeah. Oh, yeah. Even if you were only at like this. So I only got 2. Select this one, hold shift. Select that one. And then the last one is going to be the parent. So then I can push that one. Then I can let go of everything and hit P. And you should see this happen where there's the pointer at both of those.
So we're all doing this way, every single one of them, we have to do it.
Yeah, when you have your selection correct, then you hit P. And so what that will look like when you're actually in here, like in the perspective view. So if I were to rotate my wrist, the little fingers are following along now. That's the behavior you want. So an alternative workflow to doing all the parenting last, you could make one finger, parent that finger, and then just select this thing, hit Command D. Now you have a duplicate that's already parented. Oh, and so how I'm quickly tapping between the different views, if you just tap spacebar when your mouse is hovering over your viewport, you'll jump to the forward view if you're only in one. And then whichever one you're hovering over, If you tap spacebar again, that'll become the big one. So you can real quick just like pop between your different views. Yeah, so up here, if you see, do you see these blue icons at the top? This square one is mesh. So if you uncheck that, that means you can no longer select meshes.
Is there a reason why I don't see the same option?
Yeah, it might be like this, which means it's a hidden, and it's not very clear that this little triangle indicates that there's more options. So you can click that and it'll
Okay.
push them out. Is it working?
I don't see it.
The option,
Yeah, I think the little triangle.
okay, there might be two. Yep, cool. Yes, I will say, even after tens of thousands of man hours into making, or person hours, I should say, into making this menu and program better, it's still ridiculous. So don't feel like you're not getting it. If this is your first time in Maya, it takes a while. Sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't make sense. And I've been working with it for like 12 years. So it's hilarious where they put like really important stuff sometimes and then things that I'll never use. Like, I don't ever use like some of this stuff over here. Like, why, I don't know. Why is that one of the main ones? I don't know. So anyway. Cool. So at this point, the last one that we would want to get in place is our thumb. And the reason that I did these four fingers first is because they're all kind of on a nice flat plane, and when you would rotate, they would all kind of rotate all the same. But your thumb is, why we dominate the world. So we've got this thing that hinges in this weird way, and we can grab stuff. So the way that it's pointed is different than all these fingers. So to make a thumb, it still has the same number. It's just that its hinge point is basically down here by the wrist versus all the way up here. So when we duplicate this joint chain, we want our first hinge point to actually be all the way down there. Then once you have that, you can, from the top view, kind of rotate it in place that way. But the other way that it needs to actually be looking correct, it's here from the front. So I'll only pivot here along the blue. So it kind of comes down like that. But then even still, it's not quite pointing the right way. Green in Maya means Y, the Y-axis. And in general, I would recommend that you think of the Y-axis as up. So whichever direction you think the thumb is like up to the thumb is how you would want to orient your joint. So right now it's pointing like that, where really I think it should be kind of pointing off in that direction. So if I select the base, hit E to rotate, make sure that the axis orientation is set to object. You can spin it like that. So now it's pointing nicely in the right way. It's almost in the right place, but the final touch is just like, your fingers. I put the joints kind of in the middle of the volume. That's what we want to do with the thumb. Speed it down. The thumb positioning, usually I end up doing a lot of it in the perspective view just because it is in a weird axis orientation.
Wait, you said yellow is
Green is up. Y. Green is usually Y.
Yellow is the select.
Pardon?
Yellow is the select. Like if you click on green.
Oh, I see. How what? Okay, cool. Yeah, let's run through the zone one more time. So if I started with my pointer, hit Command E to duplicate it. And I'll, in the top view, kind of position it over here first. Then switch to the rotate tool with E. And only spin it like that. So now from the top, it looks correct. So I can kind of leave that. Then I'll hit tap space bar to go back to the quad. And then tap space bar to go to the front view. Then I'm going to rotate it only along the blue axis, which I believe is Z, until it looks correct. So at that point, it looks correct from the front view. Good. So if I were to tap W at this point, it would give me an indication of which direction the joint is facing for up, which is not quite right. So I'll tap space bar one more time so that I can bring up my perspective view. Hit E to go back to rotate and try and get, I know that I just said green is Y, but in this case, this yellow ring indicates kind of where the Y is coming. So if I spin it like that, and then I go back to my move tool, you can see now I'm pointing in a little bit more of a better direction for the thumb. Yeah. Okay, we can work through it in a second. All right, so kind of scoot it in here into the internals of the thumb. Just good enough. Okay, cool. So we've been, oh, go ahead. So say this again. So if you select that, it doesn't select all your joints. Here. Oh, I see. I think as like, so if you parent, you're asking why this shouldn't be parented to that. Oh, okay, they're parenting to here. Okay, cool. Then that might be just when these were not parented like that, and you wanted to make sure that these went to the right joint. If when you did your selection, sometimes it's a little hard to click on just this end one. So I guess the thing to keep an eye on is in your final selection. So I'd select 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to do the one that's going to be the parent, hold shift. If I click and it looks like that, then it's not the right one. This should not be highlighted at all. So just hit Z to undo or Command Z to undo and hold shift again and really try and just click on this joint. That's what the final selection should look like so that when you hit P, you get that.
Is there a way to pick up a joint chain once you touch off of it?
To pick up a joint?
So like if you accidentally like click off of the joint chain and instead of making a whole new one, so like at the right number of segments.
Oh, I see. Yeah, you can always, you can keep adding. So if you have your joint tool active, you can click the joint and then just keep going.
Okay, sorry.
Yep. Cool. How are people doing? And okay, cool. We'll keep pushing forward. This will be the final fire hose, and then I'll go around and answer questions individually and check them. All right. So say this is the perfect joint orientation, and I'm loving everything. So I'm going to go ahead and bind my hand to this skeleton. So you don't have to select each joint individually. You only have to select the root. And then holding shift, select your mesh. If you activated this option, you're going to have to unactivate it so that you can put that in. So with both of these selected, making sure that you have your rigging menu set active. Come over here to skin and bind skin. I'll go ahead and actually open up the options. These are the default ones. And depending on your use case, you might change these. I think for what we're doing today, this will be totally fine. The reason that we only had to select the root joint is because this option is active. If you only wanted to skin one joint at a time for some reason, you could do selected joints. So only the joints that are selected would be added to this thing. I don't want that. I want them all dropped in there. This is the other option to keep an eye on for animation in general. You can leave it at 5 and that's fine and that's great. The reason this is important is for like games, especially if you're working in mobile games. The vert right now, if I hit this option, is going to be able to talk to 5 different joints to influence its position. So I could put weight on 5 different joints to get some positioning. Why I would do that, I don't know, but I could. In game engines, you usually have the option to do either 4 or 2. The reason being that you'll get a better deformation. If you have 4 joints influencing a vert position versus 2, that'll look like really harsh when you like bend and move around. So for animation, for what we're doing in here, you don't have to change anything, but be aware in the future if you're doing games. Remember I said this way back when. Cool. So starting from no selection, click the root joint, and then holding shift, left click on the mesh. They both should be highlighted. Come up here to skin. Oh yeah, so this, remember we activated this thing? So yeah. So I'll just do the default bind skin by just clicking on it. Now, if I were to select one of my joints, activate rotate with E. Oh, look at that. Almost flapping my hand. It's so good. And Maya does its best to guess how the influence should go. It does a decent job, but if I were to go ahead and select, oops, turn off the mesh so it's easier to select. So I'll select all my fingers and rotate. Oh no, oh no, Maya, so bad. So this is the next clip of it.
Oh, I guess my only thing is, and I could find some of the blind version, or we show that stuff one more time. 'Cause it was-
Yeah, I think the only thing to make sure of is that both of the things are selected when you hit bind skin. So if you start from nothing, so nothing is highlighted, nothing is doing anything, select your, you can also select in the hierarchy, sometimes that's easier. Click on joint 1 with left click, and then holding shift, left click on the mesh. They're both selected. And get skin, bind skin. If you were successful, you should just be able to rotate and see. The other way that you can see is selecting your mesh, coming to your channel box and seeing that there is now a skin cluster as an input. All right. So what I was just mentioning is, see, the thumb is looking pretty good. Oh man, I don't have any work to do. And then coming here to the finger, and oh, I've got all the work to do to clean this up. So where to go from here? This is where the painting of weights happens. And the painting of weights is one of the more time-consuming parts of the process. one of the more frustrating parts of the process, but one of the most important parts of the process. There's definitely some artistry involved, but some tips and tricks to help you move faster. One, well, first, to just bring up your paint weights, select your mesh, right-click on your mesh, hover up to Paint Weights tool, and let go. That should bring up your Paint Weights tool. If this is the first time you're doing it, it might pop up like this. So it's just kind of hovering there. That's fine. It's going to behave the same. Like I said, I usually like to dock my tool settings over here, so they never really go away and I can always see. But what you should see is some kind of color gradient. I think the default setting might be like that, so it might be gray. If you would rather have color values influencing the visual feedback on what is and is not being influenced, underneath of this gradient option, say use color range, and that'll say red is super influenced, blue means basically no influence, 0. So you can see on the wrist or on the base joint, this is influencing this a ton, this a little bit, this a little bit less, and then almost nothing. Yep, good.
I did that, but it stayed gray and I can't see. I did it into a gradient on mine. Yeah, so those would show up. Yeah, that was as we should put
Okay, so you currently you're going. Okay, it's right click on it. And then select one again. Unless you have it really selected, you want to see whichever one you want to see. What?
You said there was no points.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to say. So even if you're in your Paint Weights tool and you had no joint selected, then you would see no visual indication of what weights are there because no joint is selected. So you can just click on whichever one to see what joint is doing what.
And blue is no influence.
Yeah, blue is no influence, like dark blue is probably 0, and then red is 100%. I flip back and forth between the color ramp or the black and white option because this I find to be really clear for when there is 0 influence, because that's just like there's nothing on there. But when I'm wanting to like do gradation or like paint a little bit of influence, sometimes the color option is a little easier to see. So you'll notice my joints are not helping me at all to know what I want to do. This brings me to my my last point before I go around and check in. Naming is really important. So as I was making my joints, I was on purpose not doing this. It's hurting me inside because something I really tried to drill in myself. Always name the thing. So this needed to be called like root. And if you want to rename stuff, the outliner is super duper powerful. All you got to do is double click and then you can put in a new name. So this is like wrist. This would be maybe hand, face. It won't let you put spaces in just because that's how the coding language works. It'll automatically insert an underscore anytime there's a space. So I put hand, face, and it automatically put in this little underscore. So just be aware when you're naming stuff, that's how it works.
How did you rename it? Did you click on it? Or-
Yeah, you can double click and you should get a little, yep. So this is 1, something like that. Pinky. All right, so pinky 1. So for final bonus, oh, go ahead. So this is gonna, sorry. Yeah, so this is probably what you see right here, this one. If there's a plus sign next to it, you can click it and it'll drop down everything inside of it. Yep, good. The really fast way of diving into a thing without having to unfold, here's a little trick. So I have select active with a select tool on. I can click the last joint in a joint chain, hover over my outliner and hit F. And it unzips all the way to the thing that's selected. That's sometimes really nice for unfolding stuff. Okay, so final tip before going around and talking. So naming conventions is something that as you get more experienced or you are doing more and more of this type of stuff, really helps workflow. So right now, all my joints are just normal names. The two things that get used a lot in naming conventions are prefixes and suffixes. So you can end something with a specific, like with a common name, and you can begin something with a common name. With joints, anytime I make a joint, I like to put a suffix at the end that always indicates that it is a joint. For me, I like just JNT, it's easy. So I do underscore JNT. All right, so I'll do a couple and I'll show you why. So Maya has basically code, or just like all programs, code's running the whole time. The language that Maya uses is called MEL, the Maya Express language. If you want to see what's going on in Maya, you can always click this little option down in the bottom. What that does is it opens up your script editor. Now don't stick with me for just a little second. So this is a readout of everything that's happening in Maya the whole time, and it'll prove it. I just clicked away, select clear. That's what that command means. I click that, select relative, meaning add and then it gives it a name. So these are the Maya commands for everything that you're doing in Maya. So if I were to copy that, minimize this here real quick. Down here, you've got like a little shelf for doing melt commands. If I were to paste that there and hit enter, it does it. So that's basically what a lot of art tools in Maya is. It's doing a bunch of commands all at the same time that maybe you do a whole bunch. The one that I use constantly is called wildcards or wildcard selection. So because I named all three of these with the same ending, there's a thing called a wildcard where you can say select, and then inside of parentheses, which is like a string, you can start it with star, and then that means anything that ends in the next couple characters, select it. So I'll put JNT. So it automatically selected all those joints because I named them all the same.
You have to put the star.
Yes, the star, it says wildcard. That's what that means.
Wait, how many stars?
Just one.
Or just one?
Yeah.
That's all.
So that's a little techy and maybe looking into the future a little bit, but that is why I'm highly recommending doing naming conventions for your stuff. I do a joint naming convention, so it's easy to select like all my joints all at once. I'm like, I want to grab all my joints, select joint. I do it with meshes too. I'll usually end in mesh. So that if I had like eyes and hats and shoes and a body, and I don't want to select each one of those each time, I'll just say select underscore mesh. Boom, it does it all. So that's wildcards. My starting out in naming is super important, not only for being able to do this fancy little tricks, but also when you are doing your paint weights. If you don't have your stuff named right, it's going to be real hard to ship and find the right joint. The other way you can activate a joint to paint is you can right click over top of it. Make sure your mesh is off. Right click over top of it. Come on, you jerk. There. Nope. See, it's so finicky. It's easier to use this menu, but won't you let me? All right, never mind. I guess it's going to be a jerk today. There we go. With the mesh out of the way. So if you right click over a joint, you can say select influence, and then that'll be the joint that you use. But like I just demonstrated, sometimes it's a little difficult to get there. So I'd recommend just selecting the thing over here. It's much easier. Cool. So I'm gonna go around checking individually with people, see where they're at. We haven't saved, or I haven't saved this entire time. That is bad practice. This whole time I should have been mashing Command S. I haven't saved yet, so my file is brand new.
Do they have like an auto save option?
There is an autosave option. I'll show you how to set that up in a second. Because I set my project directory, it automatically, when I said save, opened up my scenes folder. And when I say, and ready, I come over here to the Finder. Put the hand project. If I open up my scenes folder, you'll see handbrake. So I didn't have to do a bunch of crazy navigation to get to the right place, because right when I open my project, I set it. And then anytime I open scenes, it's always going to go to the right place. You don't have to worry as long as you do the setup. Cool. So to set up your autosave stuff, this time I'll click the little sprocket guy down in the corner. But all that's doing is opening up my preferences, which was Windows settings preferences. Underneath save actions. No. Auto save, where are you? Aha. Okay, so under files and projects, you can enable autosave. And you can give it however long minutes you want it to wait before it'll do a save. You can also limit the number. I would highly recommend doing that. Otherwise, when you're working for hours, you'll have a billion autosaves to get rid of. An autosave destination by default is set to project. So as long as your project directory has been set up, it should be dropping it. Should be dropping it in your autosave script. That's if you were to crash, that would be where you go looking for it. And Maya does crash a lot. So save and autosave is great. Cool. So I'm going to pause the fire hose, go around, check in, and then do one last demo about laying out the joints. Let it simmer for a second as I go around, and then that'll be it. And you guys can work for kind of the remainder of the class. And that's what I got planned.
When you said if you're gonna show us how to lay out the joint straight, is that really important when you're trying to like change the weight?
And it's the laying out nice straight joint chains comes into play a lot later. For this project, it won't be a huge problem if your fingers are a little crooked. But there's there's things called control schemes, and inverse kinematics is one of those. And if your joints aren't straight, it's a big problem. So getting in the habit of laying things out in a nice straight line is a good one to get. I guess I didn't mention that. Is this what happened? Place in- Yeah, those are the.
And this is what to paint.
Yeah, so if you wanted to add more information for the face.
Now that you mention that, I guess I'm not confused on how the influence relates to it not moving altogether is one.
Yep, that's good.
Okay.
But yeah, that's in case. That's, I forgot. Yeah, that's gonna be the.
Okay.
With like painting weights, if I do replace, I feel like it's adding.
Yes, so it says, take that value, and put it on that, so it's a single, you want to slowly add up, and like, gradually stuff. And we change the values to something like. So that each time you click on a bird, it adds a little bit of point.
But if I were like take away, instead of
So
the rest to it.
Yes, so this is, it's always adds.
Oh, gosh.
So, right, because like, so say you're like, take away influence from that list. Where should I put it, is what Matt wants to know. So, yeah, it's like, put it on the end of the fingers, and you're like, no, done. So, that's, just more of that, so say I move that thing, and this section. If I wanted to change the influence here, it's not that I'm going to move it, but I'm going to add it to something else. So if it was wrong, it was on here, I need to add it to whatever it should be, instead of removing it. Does that make sense? It's, yeah, it's tricky when you first do it, because you're like, well, why can't I just get this? Well, because that's the case. And unless you tell it where to go, it's going to put somewhere in.
Is that where this tool comes in?
Yeah, that's why I mentioned that. So like, when you're shooting, it's just gonna throw its best guess, and that best guess might be wrong.
With each move, are you gonna have to smooth it out differently? Or do it smooth it out?
That's just how it is. So like, how when you're doing the easy, you like shift it around to a couple of positions, and you get the best option. Because it's always gonna be the same.
I like when you have to rotate people outside something that like.
It's awkward getting used to it.
We'll go over some basic stuff. I'll actually use some materials. We can actually do, like, so, go ahead and jump out there.
Plus, I guess.
So that's selected and it has,
Are they
and then, so peak weights was,
No.
peak weight
The commander or amount is still commander.
So it might be that.
Yeah, it looks like it is in the motion.
We can just do that. Go to select. Okay, so it is gonna be- So now it's those are gonna be the only ones. So you can do a lot more. So how I usually work. Well, double click here. Switch over to words. Use the words. That just helps.
Yeah, because mine is really used to like. Maybe because mine's.
So once I have that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like working on.
Oh, it does. Mine does. So it's, yeah.
Yes, so the way we think it is, like I said, it's always a.
Yeah, but like how
We do the process. My end, I'm just gonna-
You wanna put it like this.
Yes. So in there, the best thing to do is if you don't want to that, or then you would select whatever joint you want. Add more. Yes, so, yeah, we'll go over kind of the whole flow of that, which is like we swap out. So right now, we're like, we're doing a little bit, that's kind of doing the small things. So I really need to hold on to it this way. And we'll let them later, go back to just the normal. Hit select. And then, right click and bring it up. And then double click on those. Anything that will not go select the folder. Yeah, so if you think about like. Cool. Now that we have the solution, if you were to go into the way it's isolating, so now you can use the resource tool. And so, yeah, you want all like those joints. You just drop it all in here, you're good to go. So you're no harder. So, but 100% is good. So all words are just 100%. Anymore, if you put all the inputs again, so no inputs of the word. If you do one operation where you do 100%, it'll automatically get it. So if you were to select all words on the new record, you go back to new. You do edit to whatever was your process. That's a right click on it. So now if you click it, so you click on maybe oh shit, you double click on the next one. Then you just line it up. Holy shit. And delete that. Over shipping and taxes. Cool. And then like those. Just the whole zip. Once you get the whole. All right, so look around to make sure that you're. Now, if you were to select, like, whatever. So that would have block out. Then I can go. With the built-in art, so it's like. People have. But I did this for you. Yeah, it is a back and forth. Is that the? Yeah, so go ahead and select. When I rotate this, so that means that. CC basically virtual.
Yeah.
Yes, so for this, for the state roles, you were to select, you should only see that. But if you rotated this, you wouldn't want to be. So each finger should follow the little sections. Each joint. Always have so whenever you say. My house. So it doesn't know where to put it. So generally. So if there is things here, you really want to say, put that. Then you go select maybe. So that it takes it away.
Like, so this is like. Yeah.
So. Right, so if you want to. And make sure that get some places on, make it so now if you would keep do what he's saying, let's go to switch back. Start by changing. Yeah. I'll go over the meeting today. Next time, I'll see their recommendation, which is basically their needs and needs. 100%. And then once you have that, you can go on. Just like, it's like a big square. Yeah. Sorry. Just I think it's just being like I say, okay. So that is. It's just sometimes. Yeah, so. Because you were to. If you're like, okay, we'll set it, you know, why doesn't it? So in general, I recommend you don't want, yeah, you don't want to put it on. Put it on. So you don't want to have to show danger. Wherever you go. Yeah, here's the back.
Yeah.
That headroom. This. That would pretty much only be like that'll be solid. Go back to the diffusion select. Right click on that. And then double click that. Yep. Okay, so now that that's active. Just select. All that area and stuff there. So now we right click on that. Anything we do will only affect you. We can use blood. We're all on. So that's part of it. Make sure that you're on the. It's kind of underneath the value. That takes whatever's in the value. So if you would go back. Because it always has. Wait, you have to add.
If I wanted to get rid of it.
So put it on the.
All this way.
Yeah, so like all of these words.
Okay, so you have to go into character.
It's tricky the first time.
But how to go to select.
Yeah, you can also do.
Like, just select the shape.
And that's what that's what it's. Yeah, select all the ones that you want. 100%. Just.
You select the one that you have the dot. Yeah.
Yep.
And I've been able to, changing the value down to 0, so it was 0 with, and then apply, and it'll take it off. Once I select it.
So now that
Where, okay, so here.
select the one.
Okay, so say I need to change my color. Yeah. Oh, to like get the green. Cool. I'm gonna go back to the, and then also here, there's something. It's just, wait,
Yeah, so you can do that selection of any.
then these. So like, just put on yeah, okay. Because like,
Maybe not
when you're
all.
using this color thing, the
Okay, that's.
colors are only like.
So we can convert those. Alright, so-
In order to see which direction it's dancing, you want to see, like, if you want the color. Red, orange, blue, or mesh. Because that's why you want to select. Yeah, that's what I should. Okay, so then. Press Q and put everything.
So now that that's here, there's the intro, back to the intro. Yeah. If you look at
Visual
the-
edges. There you go.
And so that's where I start. And you big, just walk it out. It's not gonna look perfect because it'll be. So that's what you do. You get them all under one. And you get them small. So like once it's 100%, just do it.
So basically, if I was
That's when
there, those were
that's
like.
when you use like, but a little bit of smoothness.
Yeah,
That's where you kind
so
of.
see this board right
So the
here,
first time
you
you
have
do
it set
it,
up to only this bigger or like this part.
it makes
bigger,
that.
and I would just- The reason that this is highlighted blue is because right now with my mom, it's like, it's.
Oh, yeah, well, this,
It's basically all very.
Okay.
Or like you wanna select the verses
Oh, yeah.
and then.
Love that. Yeah, it was like that.
You select the top.
So basically. And then,
Um,
I don't know, but it was like all the way down here. Yeah. Right.
we're ready to review.
Okay.
Oh, no,
Yeah, so then I would
So I actually, just this.
Yeah, so that-
Select which.
Now that we're all the way to the part.
So go to the.
I don't think we've done.
Go to select tool if I want to
Fortunately.
get that for not to if I like, you know, we're going to select tool, it starts to select those services.
Yeah.
Once you have that selected.
So.
Is it
you want to
okay, so like-
go ahead and select the mesh.
So what are the?
Okay.
Yeah.
Under skin.
Does it show up?
Well, now you're-
It's showing up.
Okay.
No, so.
Orientation.
Scroll over it again, like drag, we can drag. Yeah, so what you, you're selecting the edges. I was just want to get us those right lines. Select the edges. I would right if we're selecting the edges, because the edges are applied to. We should only want to select one.
So should I just put on the?
I think you might have to do.
No, that one, delete that.
Have you switched?
Select that one. That's right.
We'll just do general.
Oh, so
Basically, right click. Okay, I think that's what we need to do. So I found that, so hover over your. Well, yeah, you can just start. So go to object mode first. Because now you're out of the tool.
So object.
And then, so then, right click again, go to click
Select
stimulate.
that, hold shift, then select.
Yeah, and just now you're back where you were with Facebook, and now again.
Oh, wait, so
Right click,
this one
right
first.
click and hold. And then you're gonna go to vertex. And I think that'll change what you're selecting. So try to click the dragon. Yeah, there you go.
And then.
Yeah, change it to 0. Yeah, so change the value to 0. And then you have to switch back to.
And now when she's.
Yeah. It's probably these names as well.
And then.
Oh, wait, it's. Oh, yeah. So real quick, since you changed over to paint selector and reset your value. So.
Sure, yeah.
Bring it back down.
Whatever one is.
And that should look good. Sorry. No, you're fine. Like, you guys are, wait.
You can use it for sleep. You can set it. Does it best? Well, I've got one that's just basically.
So we have more time to start write it down.
Sure.
We didn't do the, we learned the lines because visual motor involved.
getting an introductory education, we already have a big set. So it's like I'm actually. So, I do, I have like a little bit of experience with mine, but in terms of living in. Yeah. So. Oh, thanks. You're welcome. Trying to, I guess, see similarities, or like you said, I've done
But just as a. Oh, I know. But then when you.
Yeah, but I just kind of done this around and seeing.
I find that.
But yeah, I'm sure they're doing that, like.
And that's really.
It's nice to use, but I'm like, or my steps. Yeah. And then after that, you go back to look sure.
Part operations on whichever.
Whatever we try, or what the one is.
The one that you want.
Basically, if you want to go, it's like, you can bring it into like.
It takes whatever.
You know,
So it's certainly-
so whatever area you have.
So you could do a lot of this.
You can do that with just birds. But if you go into the move.
But
It
because
will move all of the.
there's gonna be certain things, then it does. But whatever's in there, we just wanted to do that. Yeah, it goes off or on.
Then.
That probably.
It's another.
So that there's no. Okay, so I. Looks like. Really, I think it's gonna be. Are they all still in that area?
Yeah, they're all friends from the
Oh, okay. Cool. So try to get like the stuff. Sounds like you've got something. So probably gonna be this one way. Would you want that? To try and get that blue in, because you might need yeah, yeah. So now when you go back to. Yeah, that's basically.
No, it's still.
And we'll go with orbit, so that you're kind of looking down at everything. Okay, so once you're lined up, okay, this way, then that's what you need to do to this way. You know, keep it in this way and. No, I would recommend mostly using the composition. Because you save yourself.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Better. And you do a little bit back here.
Oh.
Yeah, so the idea being, I feel like the physical foundation is one axis of just of that, one axis of that. You don't really use this one, but this one, you have a difference, but having that be the last thing. You really just have nice two clean.
So, I've seen this before.
I don't know the weather of it, but this, I feel like it really.
What's nice to.
Good to get out.
Phase we figure out this.
Yep. It's always the same concept.
So I'm understanding. It's recognition to serve. Is there like?
So this game is set up very this is like a little. It's generally. Where you have. Basically, this is I will. That's like. Yeah, that'll be. This is like. The next time. Because you have like. There's the zones, there's the water, the deformation zone.
So it seems like all of my functions it's just the scale.
Do I have to
Is that?
I would.
So when
The reason that I recommend is that
Should be. Yes, okay.
So once you get a. But yeah, if you're already like. If you want to. In and out of normal. Yeah. And then go to. Yeah. There you go. You can just delete it and it's in the start. Oh, I thought that. We can undo that.
I think that's supposed to, so it seems like I did that. But in the pattern, you can show up as.
Okay, so this is actually.
Okay,
So that's better.
right?
Is why we want to be reflected. There are.
Okay.
And what we just did was we that last one. It didn't, you still have to do like, it's just your hand. And it's still. Just it's only. So, yeah, so it's visually. You could make it like that. If you make it a little bit like that, we could- Because it doesn't have carrot, it doesn't have that whole thing. I think it was all.
Yeah. It's a different language, I guess. Not yet.
Sure.
So this is for.
Yes, okay, so since you already have this. You can. So that's and if you want to go through that process, you can also just like, you get them if you're already. Anyway, that's. Yes, it was like. Yeah, it was, I read that after this. So what you know. So using a part. Yeah, it's just, it's hard to click on that one because of like.
Yeah.
So if you look it up. So now this one still is, and then you read it. Did you ever put on that or? Gotcha. I mean, if this starts to undo, like, we can do that, but there's no way that specifically undo, like, if it was the third setback. You would have to undo that. Yeah, so it looks like, well, I don't, that might be a good place to start. Just as a, you know exactly. So sometimes my first grade is just the American. So yeah.
Something happened. My foot goes.
It only respects the boots. So it always has to get shipped to the work selection. Before you get. So there is another.
Is that with that possible?
Yeah. No, it's just. Yeah, so if you go, hold on. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, who is that?
I'm sure you're just. So there, the radio name that should help out. So it'll say. Yeah, so this is my. Yeah. So you can still do the process of like this. So I need plans that I don't actually. So I'm like, okay, now I don't.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see, right here. Right here. Yeah.
Yeah, so what, the next thing I'm gonna go over is what, first thing to do. So that you can thinking these things, that's like pulling, and that the thing is why that should be 100%. So, talk about it. That's the way I can show you 100%. All the- so, the second time, you know, It's that this will. All right. We're at, I guess, about 15 minutes left, that's what I can tell. And so what I'll talk about now is the workflow that I recommend for getting through the paint process as fast as possible, because if you were to individually go in, manually paint each of these birds, it's going to take a long, long time. So there's some tips and tricks for moving faster. The first thing I would do is normalize the hand. And what does normalize mean? Put everything to one. So to do that, I need to be able to select the hand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the entire hand weighted to a single joint as my jumping off point. So I'll select my root and replace and select. And look, it's fixed the finger. It's no longer smearing, but everything else is broken. So the next step is I would highlight everything under the wrist that would be influenced by the wrist. So to do that, I'm going to do a face selection by selecting the hand, right clicking, going to face mode, and then you can grab rings of faces. And we'll go over topology in another lesson and why it's important. But this hand actually has pretty good topology for painting and animating, because you're able to do stuff like this, where I can select this face, hold shift, and double click, and it grabs this ring. And it doesn't like go wandering off into weird places and highlight weird parts of the hand. I'm like, I just want this ring. So that's a useful trick for topology. So with that highlighted, you can grow a selection by holding shift and pressing period. So you like how I'm making the polygons go more and more.
Pressing shift and more.
Shift and period. Period. So the other way you can do it is select, grow, and yeah. So now that I am to there, I'll do one more actually. So now everything after the wrist, I want to be influenced by the wrist joint instead of the root joint. And to grab these last little hangers on that aren't highlighted yet, I want to make sure that joints aren't active, because if I were to have joints be active and I try to do a drag select, it automatically goes to joints that they always pop to the top, they override stuff. So I'll deselect it, and then holding shift and control, that will always add. So the couple hotkeys that modify how you select things, if I hold shift, if it's highlighted, it'll subtract it. If it's not highlighted, it'll add it. So it toggles the selection value. If you hold control, it'll always remove. So you can remove selection. If you hold control and shift, then it will always add. So that's the one I'm going to use here to grab all the last, and just go like that, and it grabs everything. So now I've got basically the whole hand. Yep.
Did you mention tab select?
Tab select.
Yeah, so like when you're selecting faces, you can hold tab and you can like select the one.
Oh, cool. Nice. Yeah, I don't ever use that one, but that's cool. So if you hold tab and you go like that, oh, nice.
Yeah, it's a neat selection tool. There's never ending stuff in life. Thank you. That's cool. So I'll just go that one more time.
What was the step you did before, when you made the hair all white? What was that step? What was like the first step?
The flooding.
Oh, yeah, I just selected the whole hand and flooded the whole hand to one joint. That was the very first step. So this is second step. So now I'm flooding everything to the wrist. After here. So starting at this edge ring, now I'm just going to be 100% on the wrist. And so this is the main trick that will help speed up your paint. When you're doing flooding in paint weights, it always respects verts. So if you have verts selected, it'll only affect those. Why that's important is if I flip this selection over to verts by going either select vert selection to verts. Now, all verts are selected. If I go to paint weights, by right clicking on the mesh, paint weights, if I do a flood operation, it'll only affect those. So make sure the wrist joint is selected, make sure my value is set to 1, make sure that I'm on replace, and hit flood. See how these first two didn't get flooded, but everything else did. And that's basically the thing that I do over and over to block stuff out. The reason this is really nice is because I know 100% there's no influence on this beginning except this one joint. And I'll do just this finger so you can see why this might be advantageous. I'll go quick because we're running out of time. That little ring, I'm going to put 100% on this one joint. So I'll flip it over to Hertz and make sure. Okay, cool. I don't know why this is not the default of Mac, but the function keys are not set up to be function keys. If you do want them to be function keys, just flip that little toggle. So now I can just press Command F9 and it does the same selection trick. So the pointer, I don't think I've named it yet. Nope, I did not. That's bad news. What am I looking for? There we go. Then I'll flood. And then I'll do the same thing here. And grow it one more time.
Are you selecting the surrounding faces to your?
Yeah, oh, sorry. I always skip steps. So if you are in face mode and you select one face,
Yep.
and you come to another face that's part of a ring, if you hold shift and double click, it'll do the whole ring.
Yeah, and then like I saw that you were able to get the surrounding faces around that selection.
Yeah,
How did you do
holding
that?
shift and period, that's the grow selection. And because these are rings, it just goes out one.
Okay.
That's again where the topology is coming into play. If you don't have that in place, if your 3D modeler hands you a model and it has garbage topology, it might not do that.
I see.
So-
So what if you didn't have a ring selected and you did that function, like what would happen exactly?
Anything that's touching would get active. So if I just have one and I grow, it just does
Oh, okay.
anything touching. Yep. Cool. So I'll flip this over to first, plug this guy to this joint. Boom. And then I'll grab the entire end here. Careful selection.
I'm gonna specify you're like blocking it out right now.
Yep.
You're not adding like a soft select.
Nope. No, this is 100% to move faster so that I can smooth and add and stuff like that. So the final one, flood. Cool. So now I have a version of paint weights, which I would consider to be blocked out. And the type of formation you see with that is something like that, where it does move pretty good. And the main thing with painting weights that you really are trying to do is maintain volume. The thing you want to avoid is like a drink straw. Like, you know, when you bend a drink straw, it like pinches and it doesn't look like a nice round steering wheel.
Oh, yeah.
That's what fingers will do if they don't have good paint weights. They'll just deflate and become this little noodle and they look terrible. So that's why you want to be careful with where you're doing the paint weights and only smooth when you need to, but leave it like nice and influenced in other places. Yeah.
I don't know, I'm probably gonna have to see you again.
Okay, so now that I'm at this point, the thing that I would probably do is come in and start to gently add some influence, some more influence to this first one to smooth out some of this. So to do that, go ahead and select my hand, put paint weights. Make sure that I have my first joint selected. Go to add. And then what I'm going to do is change how much I'm adding each time. Right now it's set to 1, so it's like basically flood again. I don't want that. I'll change this to a little tiny number, 0.05. So now I can just gently start to paint in a little bit of influence. Like that. At any point, you can hold shift and that will smooth. So that's doing a different operation. So I'll usually just kind of rapid fire, paint a little bit, smooth a little bit. Smooth. Try and remove a little bit of that hard edge. Now we're bending a little bit better, it's still a little bit janky. What you might see here is a good example of how joint placement influences a lot how it's going to deform. I would say that this joint might be a little far back for where we would want it, because where it's pulling from, it's not really doing me any favors with painting weight. So it might need to move forward a little bit eventually. This is all things you'll learn and like get a feel for. I don't know that there are hard and fast rules for this is where a joint should go. It's more like with this mesh, this might not be the optimal placement for the joint. And as I'm painting, you know, I might be able to futz it around and get it a little smoother, but this is kind of where I'm jumping off from. The other flooding trick that I would recommend for these finger, like the middle parts, is I tend to leave something like this would be 100% influenced by that joint. This edge ring would be 100% influenced by this joint. So then what you can do in this middle is just go 50-50. So I'll flip this to a vert selection. Highlight here. So currently it has 0% on that joint. You can see it because it has nothing. It's 100% on this joint. So if I select my first joint one more time, change this to 0.5. And replace flood. I've got a nice blend between the two, 50-50. This is again where topology comes into play. It's laid out intentionally this way. There's a first ring and a last ring and a middle ring, and you can quickly move in between those. In general, higher poly models still follow this. It's just that they'll have more divisions, but there's still a beginning and an end and a middle transition zone. And the middle transition zone is where you spend time doing your add and smooth and all that kind of stuff. Okay, is that making a little sense? Yes.
This might be asking a lot, but like maybe like the Zoom chat, because like when you record the Zoom, the chat saves as well, like if you're like talking about your commands, you could just like type out what the command is and then list what it does.
Sure, yes.
Because they're really hard to, like, there's so many that they're hard.
There is a lot, yes, yeah. I wonder if there's a way to activate like what keys I'm pressing. But yeah, I'll try and start to add that. Okay. So this.
Well, I always said, one of my professors